Welcome to a lecture on team building and theories of management. So theories and practice, fantasy and reality. We're looking at the idea of how to build a team, how to model a team, how to get a team to form using various management theories. And there's also a meta theme to this week's lecture, which is to actually think, what is it about management theories that make them work or do not make them work? And it's usually to a concept that will be a very important part of any management education course. It's a concept taken from statistics, and it's originally a quote from statistician George Box, and it's simply, all models are wrong, some models are useful. And so we'll address that in practice and look at each of the models we look at today and analyse them from the point of view, are they wrong, are they useful? Thank you. So to start, let's go straight to the PowerPoint. You don't want to be looking at me anymore. So, deliberately looking from the point of view of fantasy and reality. So looking at clearly from the idea of management and team building and the theories of models. And many people have taken part in these and often felt that they probably did bear more relation to fantasy than to reality. And we'll take a look at that. So before, my name is John Fanning. I'm a senior lecturer in international strategy at the University of York at the time of making this video. So what is it that we're going to be actually talking about today? Well, one of the important lessons from today is how to use theoretical models, understanding of how theoretical models work. What is it about theoretical models that's important? What is it that's wrong? How can we use them? And it's important to actually look at the models, all the models that you learn about when learning management theory or organisational theory, and question them. In practice, too often management consultants will turn up with an untried model or a model that has been tried elsewhere and is not particularly appropriate for your organisation and attempt to impose it. We'll look at that in a broader picture in other videos, and we'll consider it from the point of view of the declining rate of profit and its impact on technological development. But today we're going to look at a much more simple thing, not look at the underlying reasons for why the models might not work, just at how to test them so they don't work or not. So the models we're looking at today is like how we will work together in teams, and look at a variety of models that relate to that and how we're going to use them. The working together in teams, with that, we'll also actually try and ask you to look at how do you analyse your own role and your own ability in the team. And we'll use a little model called Belvin as self-analysis. It's one of those models that is used to actually try and detect a personality in you and decide how that personality might best make your role in the team work. We'll also look at the ideas of team building itself, how a team forms and how it progresses through time, and we'll look at the work of Tuckman. So note these are all samples. There are many, many models that operate that. We'll also consider the broader concept of groupthink. Again, there'd be separate lectures on groupthink available, but we're just going to look at it the most briefest part here so that we get an understanding of it as part of our work. So, start at the beginning. Management theories, models. We'll look elsewhere, like I said, at the two wide application of poor quality management theories. We'll look at them for the rate of declining rate of profit. We'll look at them from the point of view of management consultants trying to sell a solution to a problem, whether or not you have the particular problem they're actually trying to solve, and the importance of this. But today in the lecture on criticising management theories, I want to look at it from the point of one basic philosophy, which I think is if you're going to be involved in management education, you're going to be involved in theoretical learning of management, and you're going to make use of them, you should be aware of this particular quote. All models are wrong, some models are useful, by George Box, who's talking about statistics, but I do think it is relevant even here, to even more so here perhaps, to management theories. And I say this is the meta-learning of this video. Even if you look at individual models and theories, the meta-learning is how do we incorporate this understanding that the models may actually not be as helpful as we'd like them to be, but actually, in my opinion, it makes them more helpful once we understand what the problems and the issues are. So, fundamentally, it might seem a strange question, but what is a team? Well, having talked about the problems with management consultancies, I'm going to show you the picture that I was given when I first got involved in this sort of work. And a management consultancy, a very high profile one, came in to give us an addressment to what a team is, and they showed us this picture. Now, I have some fundamental problems with this picture as being the one that covers the concept of a team, because it may have elements of teamwork about it, and it may well say, oh yes, it's all working together, but it's actually 8 people, 8 large guys going backwards, and one smaller woman shouting at them through a megaphone. It's rowing 8 and a cox. It's a team in which we have 8 almost identical people. Their role is almost identical. They're all just there for strength, and only one person is actually in charge. Only one person is giving instructions. This is not what I would consider to be a good model of a team, and I suggest it's been a lazy model of a team as put forward by the management consultancy. So what really is a team? Well, a team is something you put together to solve problems, or that problem might be to win a game of football, it might be to solve a managerial problem, it might be fix a puzzle, etc. And so you're actually going to think about the different skills and variety you need in a team. So I would suggest, let's look at a task. Let's say your task is to steal the gold from the dragon. What sort of team do you need to put together? Well, a much better model of a team is put together. You'd think, well, what do we need to do in order to get hold of the gold? Well, we'd probably like to fight the dragon. So let's introduce ourselves a warrior armed with sword and bow, ready to take on the dragon and defeat them. But actually a single warrior is not likely to do very well against a dragon. So what might you do? Well, you could get 8 warriors, identical warriors, like you do the thing. They're all strong rowers, and you could give them all spears and shields. You could charge them in against the dragon. But in likelihood is you're going to end up with a lot of Kentucky Fried rowers. So the reality is you need people with different skills to match up again there. You might need more than one warrior, maybe actually a different type of warrior. You might need a proud knight filled with holy power, who is blessed by God and there to fight for truth and justice. Put it together. And that gives you people who might fight together. But of course, you don't need all that particular type of warrior. For this, you have to find the dragon. You have to be able to sneak into its lair undetected. And for that, you're probably likely to need a warrior who's more a way of the woodsman, a ranger, to find the dragon's lair, to allow you to get into the dragon's lair, perhaps a little more secret, so it's not a full frontal assault, in order to actually establish it. And what else might you need? Well, you certainly will need some sort of sorcerer or wizard, won't you, to cast protective magic spells, to cast attacking spells to help you overcome the dragon. And while these 4 are busy fighting the dragon up front, well, if you really want to get the chance of the gold, if you want to draw the dragon out, maybe actually what you really need is a small dwarf thief to sneak in round the back and grab a share of the gold so you can get away with it. And of course, anyone who fights dragon is going to end up burned and bitten. So I think it's very important for any such team to have a healer to help them get on with the process of curing it. So that's what I say, when you think about a team, this is to me a much better model of a team, a much better image of a team to have in your mind when you're thinking about forming a team. Think about what the team is trying to achieve, the skills it needs in order to go forward. So let's clear that. That's the question about models are wrong, models are useful. So the rowing team theory, what can we say about that? It's wrong. It's straightforward wrong. There is no way to build or design a team. And it is not particularly useful because you're not ever going to be really looking for 8 identical people to carry out a task and one person to shout at them. Why not go the whole hog and actually use a model of a Roman slave galley and actually have the people chained to their oars and rowing in time to the drums? So I don't believe this one is a particularly useful model. How about the Dungeons and Dragons model, the one we looked at there? Is that useful? Is that right? Well, there's no dragons in the real world, or that need slaying. There may well be theoretical dragons, or there may be apocryphal dragons, but there are no real dragons. So you could say, to a certain extent, it is wrong from that point of view. But I think it's a very useful way of thinking when you're trying to put a team together, to think of it from the point of view of the different warriors, etc. you may use, the different sources, the different teams. What is actually the skills you need? Because teams are there to serve different roles. So what might you do to make an effective team? Okay, to make an effective team, I think one of the first things you need to look at is understand that there's a variety of tools and techniques that management are using in order to enable them to make an effective team. But there's a certain number of different ways of doing things, of course, but the reality in the end is that much of what your people are talking about, much of the way they're trying to work, is going to be dependent on a particular style of using different types, different techniques, different tools, the sort of things that will enable them to put together a good job. And so there'll be sort of technical techniques, there'll also be models, etc. Yeah. Companies do this. Companies make a real commitment to investment in teamwork because it is one of the ways in which they make sure that there is plenty of work going around, where they deliver much of their project. There can be different types of teams they do that for. There might be your day-to-day team. They might want you to function as part of the accountancy group, the human resources group. But there's also special projects with more interesting ways of working, perhaps, in which you may well be looking for individuals to come together for shorter periods of times. For instance, you may have to deliver. Previous role I had was as an engineer. We had to build a power plant. You need to get to construction workers, computer workers, electronic engineers, mechanical engineers, etc. That's a very big project team, but there may also be some much smaller project teams. We're looking maybe to solve a problem, develop a piece of software, develop a training course, etc. That might require a variety of knowledge and people coming in there. So that's one of the reasons why it's very important for companies to have them. And we form teams because when it comes down to it, to put the crunch down there, teams are formed because they achieve far more as a group than their individual members can achieve on their own. So that is why we form teams. That's why teams are important to us. It's also true that it's very, very useful and very fun and very exciting. It's one of the most enjoyable parts of work to be part of a high-performing team. So we need to get towards the stage of the team being high-performing, things being good, things being working well together. And take patience and professionalism to get to that place. So with the subject of professionalism, let's consider teams are great. And I suggest let's have a quick watch of this little clip to show just how great teams can be. Perhaps slightly more seriously though, let's actually look at what constitutes a good team. And the first theory we're going to look at is the one I mentioned. We're going to look at Belvin. Belvin roles are basically the idea of what do you think you are, and they're based around the concept of everybody being part of the team, being part of one of 3 mega groups, which are further broken down into 3 individual type personality types. Belvin reckoned that groups and teams needed people, action task oriented people, and thinking people. So far, yes, you might think that seems quite straightforward, no great declarations there that prove a huge amount of things. So, looking forward, what sort do we mean by people? Well, he said you need a resource investigator, someone who will go out and find you the contacts, find you the information, find you the resources you need as a primary part of the team. He said you would need a team worker, someone who would be cooperative, actually bring people together, get them working together, avoid friction and make sure the team actually can function and stop eternal fighting. I need a coordinator, the mature, confident, the kind of typical, what he would call a team leader, but I'd say was less leadership and more managerial, and would clarify the goals and try and push people towards decision making and delegate the various tasks. Having said about tasks, you need people to actually carry out those tasks. You need a shaper, someone who thrives on pressure, someone who can actually get you to go forward and achieve the aims that you're trying to get to. So actually to keep it clear on what you're actually trying to achieve. But in doing so, you need someone who can be a bit more conservative, a bit more efficient to make sure that those ideas that the shapers could have actually turned into practice. And you need a completer finisher, someone who actually says, well, we're turning them into practical action, we're going to make sure we get them done. The sort of person who says that the enemy of good is perfect and says, actually, no, we need to get something out there on time and ready and usable. You do that. And then they're thinking about that. You also need the people who can think about it. You need the creative types, he calls them plants, who can solve the problems that get always going to appear at some point in any teamwork, any project work. You need specialists, or maybe the technical specialist, the accountant, the human resources, the computer person to actually bring a project, bring to the skills to a project that you actually need to achieve. It's all very well having ideas if you don't have the people who can actually do those roles. And you need someone to be able to stand to one side and check what you're doing is correct, evaluates all the options, judges them accurately and brings them forward. You might think there's nothing really particularly spectacular about there, and so Belvin's quite doing that. So what exactly is Belvin? Well, Belvin is basically work that is a personality test. It's one of hundreds that are available on the market. Many people have developed their own personality tests, and that's because it's a very competitive market. There's money in it. So people want to bring out and bring their own ideas forward and suggest new ones. Belvin is one that's taken off, and you can take Belvin by filling out a questionnaire. The questionnaires you have to pay if you're going to use them. There are sample ones available, so I'm sure you've already go at doing a Belvin, but the full questionnaires are quite an expensive piece of work. They're basically based on the work of Carl Jung. Carl Jung worked on the idea of opposing personality types, and that these paired personality types would work together and or work against one another, and you could bring together a whole list of the different types of personalities. And so basically this work that we're talking about, the thoughts of Belvin, is based on that. Like I said, though, it's an extremely competitive market, and elsewhere in videos we'll look at the declining rate of profit applied to these sort of technological ideas, and the idea why technology and why concepts and knowledge are pretty much the same thing in the economic markets. And so that's one of the things that have pushed out other ones and forced people to be making constant updates. Belvin, for instance, has gone from 8 to 9 people. So, is Belvin wrong? Well, Belvin's quite clearly wrong on a number of issues. Let's be straight about this. Far too simplistic. 9 people? Should every team have 9 people? Of course they shouldn't. So where do you get all the different skills from? If you've got less than 9 people, how do you balance out different skills? You've got more than 9 people. Belvin was obviously clearly based on this idea that they're trying to produce a version of the personality test that was usable. Does everybody have a fixed contribution? Are you always the same role in a team? Can you be flexible? It's all very well to say the team needs someone who's a shaper. It's very different to say you are always a shaper. And this is the problem with Belvin's, and one of the many problems with it. So you've got to be taken with a pinch of salt. But is Belvin useful? It reminds you to recruit to the team, not just recruit an individual. Don't say, oh, I need an accountant. Say, I need an accountant and my team needs that. That's quite an important thing to remember if you're building a team. So I really think it's like that. It reminds us that diversity is itself a strength. It helps people to actually work together, helps people to understand that you actually need different ideas coming in. It helps people to know their role and their job within a firm beyond the companies like that. So it does have a great many uses, does Belvin, but it's not in itself correct. It is not right. It is wrong, but it is useful. And it's important to bear those two things in mind. So looking after that, you've got your group together, you've actually designed them, you've developed them, you've recruited them, you've got a team. How do you go about forming a team? And again, we have models and theories for that. I'll just look at one of them to give you some idea of this. I'm going to look at one developed by Tuckman Forming storming, the original concept was 1965. Since then it's been developed further. There's various stages of team formation have been introduced. Who have we got? So actually it's a 4-stage originally and now a 5-stage formation. And you start off your team forms. Effectively you try and get people to come together and work together. Doing that, and to get to know one another. You then have a process that we go on to is called storming. That's when you start to iron out the differences between each other, try and find out what each individual roles are going to be. We're going to say something that's called norming. This is when you actually start to understand your position within the team, start to understand how you're going to get on together, how you're going to work together, standings for that. We have something called performing, and this is the bit when teams actually perform and it's very strong and when things are going on. And then later on the development of the theory, Tuckman introduced a final thing called adjourning, which is a very, very important process. So to briefly look at the various points of team development again, let's just go back through them and say, what did he actually say? Okay, he said forming is when you start to get together. It's first introduced you, so there's a little bit of nerves, perhaps when people start to learn about one another, get to know one another, learn names, learn backgrounds, learn what they may be able to contribute, what they may be able to do. And then we go into the storming. Again, this is when a firm, in his way, an organisation, a team, tries to, as it is a group of people, of course, come together who are just individuals, and it transfers to its to be, what it's going to be. What is this team actually trying to achieve? What is this team's purpose? How is it going to develop itself? How is it going to shape itself? Now, storming can be very controversial. It's when people can argue about the different roles in the team, who's going to be leadership, who's going to do this, who's going to do that, what's the process of doing the work is. And then we reach a consensus. And when under norming, we reach a consensus on what it's to be. And once a team has agreed how it's going to work, it can then be to the most effective and most exciting part of being part of a team, performing. It's settled its relationship expectations, and it can get on with the job in hand. And a team that's gone through these stages, Tuckman believes, will be very, very successful. He also then said, well, if teams and organisations want to learn, something called organisational learning, then in fact it's important that it shares and improves the processes with others, both within and without the organisation. So that becomes an important concept as well. So we go through all these things: forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. Adjourning is a problematic stage in that too many companies, too many organisations do not actually undertake adjourning, and they actually move away from what they're supposed to be doing, and they end up in a situation in which they don't actually team work on their own. And that can really be a problem for organisations as a whole, in that they don't take the benefits of successful teams, or they don't take the learning from failed teams away with them. So, is Tuckman right? Tuckman is not right. You may have guessed this. Tuckman is wrong. Teams never go backwards. Do you really believe that? I think it's very fair to say that Tuckman is wrong on this, that teams do go backwards, that it's very much a cycle rather than a simple linear progression. Teams come to a controlled end. This is the big problem. He actually only introduced adjourning later on when he realised that actually many organisations weren't learning from their teams. What happens at the end of a team is actually people may decide that they don't want to learn the lessons. What they're actually interested in doing is getting forward as fast as possible. They're even trying to get out, to get onto the next role. That can be because they're excited for the next role. It can be because they're running away from problems. It can be because they're actually, having been a success, rather than taking time to reflect on that success and help the organisation to learn from it, they want to use that success to get themselves a next role, a promotion, etc. So this can be very problematic for all involved. But is Tuckman useful? I say it's very useful. It reminds us teams are not born functioning. Teams, all teams, whether you're a championship winning football team or an accountancy team trying to work out how to best present the books, are not born functioning. Okay, they need to work through various difficult stages at the beginning, and if to get out of the difficult stage into the next stage, we don't need to aim for perfection. We can actually just say that there's an interim stage, and that's Tuckman is useful in that point of view, and it introduces the concept of interim stages in team development. It also tries to push forward the argument that do not run away from success and or failure. These twin imposters, as the poetry puts it. Try and capture the learning. Understand the success, understand failure. Try to capture learning from it. Treat these twin imposters the same. And then we can learn from them, and then we can go forward and we can develop our ideas, and we can maybe help develop the group as a whole. So we've got this idea. We've formed our team. We've recruited to our team. What actually problems can we come up with? Now, there'll be separate talks on groupthink and information on groupthink, but I do think it's important to address it here while you're fresh in the idea of thinking about teams. Groupthink is where a team, organisation, gets stuck in a particular way of thinking which is caused by a lack of diversity within the organisation. And there are some spectacular examples of this. We have the Challenger spatial disaster, where people actually identified that there was a problem with the O-rings that control the flow of fuel and that they were prone to rot them. But because various junior engineers have identified this, found it difficult to speak out to senior engineers, and they were trapped in a hierarchical structural thinking, and they all came from similar backgrounds where they would believe that it was difficult to speak out. If you look at NASA at the time, it was white, male, MIT effectively. And there's nothing wrong with white males from MIT, but if all you've got is white males from MIT, then they're likely to think like that. And in this case, it was an absolute disaster, and the shuttle was destroyed for want of a small part that could have been replaced very cheaply. And of course, 7 people lost their lives, as well as it being $1 billion disaster. The Bay of Pigs invasion. This was, looking back on it, this is Cuba. This was where the first ideas of groupthink came from. What happened here was that Cuba had overthrown the Batista government, which was very friendly to the United States, and it replaced it with the Castro government, which was a communist government, was not friendly to the United States. But that's another story, because it didn't initially start out that way. It was willing to talk to the United States once it got rid of Batista. But because of various things to do with seizure of property, etc., the closing down of casinos, there was a lot of difficulties in trying to get people to accept the thing. And the Cuban emigres in the United States had the ear of the government, they had the ear of the Kennedys, often seen as great liberals, and it was decided they convinced Kennedy that a small force of their own troops trained in Florida, land on the coast of Cuba at a place called the Bay of Pigs, would cause an uprising across Cuba. Castro, who was very unpopular, would be thrown out, and effectively a regime sympathetic to America would be reinstalled and American property would be restored. However, as it turned out, and as anyone who knew anything about Cuba could tell you, Batista had been extremely unpopular. He was a brutal dictator, and whatever Castro's faults were, there was no way people were going to rise up and greet Americans as liberators. In fact, several hundred troops landed on the beach and were very quickly defeated, some killed, many captured, paraded through the streets. It was an absolute disaster. And anyone looked at it and said, well, of course it's going to disaster. How could this anyone possibly believe in this? And they examined a number of elements of it and came to the conclusion that effectively Kennedy's ear had been captured by the Cuban emigres, and the rest of the cabinet, who were all white males from the same East Coast schools, were very reluctant to stand up to him. So there's an awful lot of problems that's highlighted. And you may think, looking at this, that actually things like the invasion of Iraq, etc., may well actually show, or the invasion of Afghanistan from the Soviet Union, may show that this way of thinking never really went away. I'm sure as well that there are plenty of examples for other cultures. If we wanted to look, I'm sure some of you at your own governments, you can, in an honest way, you can identify times when lack of diversity in thinking has caused strange decisions to be made that on reflection look like no one could ever really have believed that they would be appropriate. Okay. Many of the people who planned these were what we call strategic or stochastic, in that they thought only of the strategy, they did not reflect on it, they didn't have any ability to deep thinking, they didn't have an alternative ideas coming forward. So it's important that we remember that as we make our own planning. So what are the symptoms of groupthink? Look at work of Janis. We can say that groupthink symptoms include things like an illusion of invulnerability, the belief that you're right, and that if you stand up against this general belief, you actually start to undermine the organisation. Collective rationalisation. Members of the group think thoughts suggest that challenge what the majority are thinking. They try to give reasons why the others don't agree and thereby go ahead with their original decisions. They believe in the inherent morality of the group. We are right, we are honest, we are just, we are decent. They think that people outside the group somehow are inferior, they have different group stereotypes. They believe that actually that anyone who opposes what the group is doing are not doing so out of an argument whether they think it's going to be successful or not, but because they fundamentally disagree with the achievements. It becomes very difficult then to stand up to the group. There is direct pressure on dissenters. People who actually try and argue against it can be pushed out of the group. The idea in the long term is to make sure that there's no one in the group who disagrees. So the group becomes more and more offensive. If you want to reign on the inside, certainly the political situation, you're trying to get close to the president, you can get something as self-censorship. And this gives an illusions of unanimity where people actually seem to think that everyone agrees, whereas the reality is people are just not talking out because they find it difficult to get a voice heard, and of course they don't want to lose their position within the group. And so people in the group then will become the most fanatical about defending the general interests of the group and denouncing anyone who attacks what the group's trying to do, or try to criticise the way the group's trying to do something, is a direct attack on what the group is actually trying to do. So these are very important key areas to consider. So we can go through all this sort of thing and consider what exactly is it that we're going to be looking at next. So how do you overcome groupthink? It's very important if you're going to be part of any organisation, any team, doing anything from a real project to a group project within a university, etc. Try and think about the different approaches. Use brainstorm, properly brainstorm. When you say there are no bad ideas, agree with that. Write down every idea that's generated. Don't start off by saying, "Oh, that's a silly idea." Maybe that was a silly idea. Maybe the idea that the next person will have next will be a good one. But if you told them that idea is a silly idea, you're reducing their ability to speak out. Maybe it might sound silly in the first place, but there might be something in that idea. So properly brainstorm. Bring out all the ideas. Use a nominal group technique. This is a group process where you look at and identify the problem and you look at how to generate solution decision making. It can be used in groups of many sizes who want to make a decision quickly by vote, but they want to make sure everyone's opinion is taken into account. The problem with traditional voting systems is that actually you can't always be sure that you get everyone's voice. So here you vote but different. Simply nominal group method. Every member of the group gives their view of the solution with a short explanation. Duplicate solutions are limited from the list of all solutions, and the members proceed to rank the solutions first, second, third, fourth. So what happens up, and so on. And so this works that way. Then you get this idea from people which is the most preference wins. It's kind of it's not simple majority voting. Everyone gets to put forward an idea for consideration and has an opportunity to talk about it. It's really important, no matter how daft you may think an idea is, let it come out. There may be something in it, and it's this thing doing that. There are also ways of thinking that sort of came out. There's one thing called the 6 thinking hats, where you talk about different colours of hat. Managing blue, what is the subject? You can make sure everybody's in the group that every single hat is represented. So you have managing for blue, you have information for white, emotions for red, discernment for black, optimism for yellow, creativity for green. It's important that you look at these all together. We also have things called the Delphi technique. The Delphi technique is like a panel you might have for fate, which is a match of the day or on a political problem. But instead of having 3 or 4 people sat there discussing it all together, in which case you actually have a situation which you can develop groupthink as people start to agree with one another or talk over one another. You have a situation in which the panel do not actually meet. The panel write their opinions and then you distribute those opinions around everybody else anonymously, so you don't know whose ideas they came from, and then people are asked to rewrite their opinions based on those, and you go on to this, and eventually when you believe you're getting more towards a consensus, the group can meet face to face and actually have a longer ongoing discussion. So that's one way of overdoing it. Of course, the obvious thing to do to overcome groupthink is to make sure you have diversity in your membership, you have plenty of different ideas coming from different areas, different experiences, and to make sure the group always has a devil's advocate. The Kennedy's administration's response to Bay of Pigs was to appoint Robert Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, who was the president's brother, whose job it was to always argue with whatever somebody suggested in cabinet. And John F. Kennedy actually stopped attending cabinets a lot of the time because it was felt if John F. Kennedy expressed an opinion, then other people would tend to flock to that opinion. So he was trying to actually get people to come up with their own opinions first. So let's treat groupthink the same as do. Is groupthink wrong? Well, clearly, I don't think it's wrong. I think there's a lot about it that is right, but in a way, it could be said to be wrong if you take it as a complete model. And if you look for all the problems and all the symptoms of groupthink in any one place, then actually you will not find them, and therefore you could say under those circumstances, yes, it is wrong. Is groupthink useful? Well, I think it's very useful. I think it helps when you build your team from scratch. Remember, Belvin came up with some suggestions, but actually how you do it, another thing which Belvin was wrong, it's actually true, you do need diverse ideas, but you also need diverse backgrounds. Not just 8 or 9 different personality types, you need people who bring different experiences, different ideas in. It's useful in structuring it in such a way that you make sure you make good decisions by making sure you get everyone's ideas included. So I think that's very important to get involved and working properly. Yes, it's useful in promoting opportunities for all, making sure that everyone has a say, and making sure that actually we don't end up having a different difficulty with people, that everyone gets involved. So I think it is very useful from that point of view. It also reminds that diversity is not just a nice politically correct option, but it is an effective operational necessity. So serious managers will operate in a manner that is often accused of being politically correct, but if you see it these days, you'll see this sort of thing throughout the US military, throughout big US corporations. They're not organisations that are anti-capitalist or are expected to be politically correct. These are organisations that are interested in making sure they make fundamentally the correct decisions in important and expensive environments. So yes, from that. So remember, throughout this, to take away the learning about the individual management theories, but also remember to take away the big core philosophy of all sensible management thinking. Remember, all models are wrong, but some models are useful. George Box, the statistician. Thank you for listening.